In the early 18th century, the complex interaction of social, economic and farming technology changes resulted in the British Agricultural Revolution. From 1700 onwards, the modern era saw a period of great change unfold across the world. Every aspect of daily life was transformed in some way or another. In agriculture, mechanical inventions such as the horse-drawn seed drill and the Rotherham triangular plough, together with the adoption of the four-crop rotation system, enabled a move from agrarian subsistence farming to commercial business operations, selling increasing food surpluses to emerging local, national and international markets. But over the last century, the global population has quadrupled. In 1915, there were 1.8 billion people in the world. Today, it's estimated that there are over 4 times that number, and we're repeatedly reminded that this figure may reach almost 10 billion by 2050. This population growth continues to drive up the demand for food at a time when the land available for farming is decreasing. The number of farm holdings in England and Wales has fallen from 440,000 to 170,000, while the number of farm workers has decreased significantly from around 1 million to 180,000. Britain's ability to feed itself is now in long-term decline, with self-sufficiency falling from 78 to 60% in the last 30 years. Technology and digital disruption change the status quo. But as agricultural technology becomes ever smarter, so too do the food retail and food services sectors. The way we live our lives, travel and communicate is changing rapidly. New ways of shopping and the rise of new retail offers have had their impact. Tesco is a good example of this. The retailer remains the UK's leading online grocery shopping service, but it has competition from the discounters as well as online providers such as Amazon. Simply hailing a cab has become a digital experience, and defining our present location or navigating to it has been revolutionised by easy-to-use apps. And in New Zealand, the humble pizza is now being delivered direct to customers using UAVs or drones. While in the United States, you can even have your pizza 3D printed.
Field of barley grown without any help from the farmer or from any people at all. That's the aim of the
Change is unavoidable. It happens with or without you. Change can be intimidating, and embracing it takes courage. Change can alter the way you think and bring opportunity. Agriculture is an industry built on change, and in this rapidly evolving world, the picture, psychology and impact of change is governed by how we embrace it, and no more so than by our farmers, agronomists, scientists and food industrialists whose vision and expertise we rely on for our very survival.
Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to day 2 of the Oxford Farming Conference. Fantastic to see you all here. For those of you who weren't at the dinner and drinks reception last night, my name is Caroline Miller. I was asked last night by Ted McKinney, what role does Oxford Farming Conference play in UK agriculture? And how does it stay relevant after starting back in 1936? So as many of you know, this is the main thought leadership event in UK agriculture for the whole of the UK. We're not a conference where you can come and kick tyres or bring your sheep, but we're a place where leaders, innovators, progressive, forward-thinking farmers get in one room and spend 3 days together. We have every age represented here, we have every part of the UK represented here, and every part of the supply chain. Our conference agenda, sustainability, innovation, technology, global trade, succession and family businesses, the environment, and our role in society to feed the population. These are all items that are in our agenda and our programme this year, as every year, and they're completely relevant to all the big questions in agriculture currently. The people in this room can really drive change. You are the talent, or most of the talent in the UK industry is in this room, which is very, very powerful. And we won't drive change sitting at home on our own. When we come together at the Oxford Farming Conference, we debate, we challenge, and we inspire each other. We have a full house here. We're completely sold out for the 3-day ticket. We had 500 in the room here, many more in the Sheldonian tomorrow. We have 80 media here. We have 7 TV channels. We are live streaming the politics session this morning. And as part of our charitable status, we will share all the videos from the conference on our website from tomorrow. The conference itself is not standing still. We are embracing change ourselves. We must do the same as the rest of the industry. Tomorrow we will trial a new venue at the Sheldonian. We have massively expanded our digital communications this year, and we're sharing everything with a much wider audience. And tonight we'll have our first ever comedy night, which I'm sure you'll find great fun. We must embrace change as individuals and as an industry. And I have a personal interest to make sure we support people who find a perceived negative change something that's a challenge. We must support these people when they feel their heads go down and they don't know how to deal with it. And we must support them as an industry as we go forward. I'd like to thank all the patrons and sponsors for your support. It's very much appreciated. In particular, our principal sponsors. Thank you to Massey Ferguson for sponsoring this morning's politics session, and to Volac for the delegate folders. There's just one slight change to the programme. We're delighted to welcome Dieter Helm to come and speak to us today before lunch. And Mark Linus will be returning to Oxford Farming Conference, and he'll be speaking now tomorrow before lunch. If you've not downloaded the app yet, there is a slide coming up to show how to do that. So it's pretty easy to use, but if you haven't downloaded it yet, this is how you do it. There's also 2 digital experts who are going to help anyone who has trouble downloading the app or can't even switch on their computer. If you see them at the coffee break and during lunch, Mike and Andy are going to help people. Another new thing that we're doing this year. We will be doing live polling as part of the politics session. If you go onto the app and you'll just see the button that says live polling, you can take part in the poll. If you'd like to ask a question, there's a button on the app that says ask a question. Again, you just press the button and you type in your question and it will go up. And when we're doing the chairing of the sessions, we will take some questions from the audience and some through Twitter and some from the app. So if you're a shy person that doesn't want to stand up, submit your question in via the app. We have a Wi-Fi code, which is just coming up on the screen for anybody that hasn't already downloaded and got onto Wi-Fi. And I encourage you to tweet as much as possible. There's thousands of people literally interacting with everything going on here at home. So if you can tweet and use the hashtag OFC18, as shown here. So the housekeeping, just some brief housekeeping. We have no fire drills planned In the case of an emergency, the doors are here and at the back, and you assemble in the quad outside. And I just encourage you to really enjoy the conference and to stay to the end of the conference tomorrow afternoon with our networking lunch. We've got a brilliant showcase of British food with a street food networking event, which will take place after tomorrow's Sheldonian. So thank you very much. And now I'd like to call on Anna Hill, who will take over and chair the politics session. Anna.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Good morning and welcome to everybody to this politics session this morning. I might be wrong, but I feel there is rather a strong sense of anticipation here in the room this year. The Oxford Farming Conference happened to be the second lead story on Radio 4 news bulletins this morning, and that's mainly due to one of our contributors this morning, and I'm sure he will enlighten us even further in a moment. Since last year, rather like the Brexit talks really, we seem to have scaled the foothills of the journey of change and left behind the rather foggy mists of the lower foothills and the confusing picture into a little bit more of a clearer sense of what might be before us. This is your chance, though, to influence that. This session today, we're going to hear from 3 speakers, and afterwards we're going to have a Q&A session, as Caroline said, but this is your chance to ask the questions that you want to hear the answers to. You can ask them anonymously on the app. I can't promise we will be able to answer every single question that's asked in the time given, but we will try our very best. We will also have some roving mics around in the old-fashioned way, so you can also ask questions that way. Now to our panel. You've probably noticed I have only 3 chairs up here on the stage. Unfortunately, Paolo de Castro, the Vice Chair of the European Parliament's Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee, is unable to be with us because of a bereavement. He's not here in person, but he has sent us a video of his speech, and he will be joining us virtually online to answer questions after the speeches have been given. So I might ask you all at that time to all cross your fingers together, because we know how these things don't work. So we will need a little bit of help there maybe. We're also very pleased to welcome Ted McKinney from the USDA. He's the Undersecretary for Agriculture with special responsibility for trade. He farms in Indiana along with his twin brother. So he says it's him here, a bit like my rig. Couldn't tell the difference between you and your brother. His feet are firmly on the ground in the soil while talking trade across the world. And our first speaker is Michael Gove, Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Having been in the job just over 6 months, I think I can say he is a breath of very fresh air indeed. And I would say he is probably the perfect fit for the title of this year's conference, Embracing Change. So I'd like to welcome Secretary of State Michael Gove to the podium.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you, thank you. Well, can I begin by thanking Anna for her very kind introduction, to Caroline for chairing and leading this conference so brilliantly, and to all the sponsors who've made sure that we can enjoy these 3 days of debate, reflection, and hopefully confidence about the future. And for anyone who was wondering what the focus of this year's Oxford Farming Conference might be, it was the Archers who provided us with an answer just before Christmas. Brian Aldridge asked his stepson Adam whether he might be attending the conference, and Adam replied wearily, "I think I'll give it a miss this year. It's probably going to be all about Brexit. I get enough of that at home." I know how he feels. I suspect everyone in this room knows how he feels. And of course, I will say something in a moment about the specific opportunities and particular challenges for agriculture on leaving the European Union. But I think that if we're going to make the most of those opportunities and overcome those challenges, it's critical that we recognise that there is much, much more that is changing in our world than just our relationship with the European Union. As we saw in the presentation right at the beginning of this session, the world's population is growing at an unprecedented rate, with a worldwide migration from rural areas to cities, and a growth in the global middle class, which is driving demand for more and for better quality food. Technological change is at an inflection point. Developments in big data, artificial intelligence, and machine learning mean that processes which would have required the intellect and effort of thousands of humans over many hours in the past can now be accomplished automatically by digital means in seconds. These technological breakthroughs raise political and moral questions as we consider how we deal with the transformation of a huge range of existing jobs. And alongside these changes in the world of IT, there are biotech changes coming, which also challenge us to think about the future and how best to shape it. Gene editing technology could help us to remove vulnerabilities to illness, develop even higher yielding crops or more valuable livestock. Indeed, they could potentially even allow mankind to conquer the diseases to which we ourselves are vulnerable. Food in abundance, improved health, greater longevity. These are all goals to which our species has aspired since the first farmers waited for the first harvest. But in attempting to shape evolution more profoundly than any plant or animal breeder ever has done before, are we biting off much more than we can chew? And these are not the only changes coming. Our global environment is affected as never before by the population growth that I've referred to, and the consequent growth in demand for nutritious food, safe drinking water, comfortable housing, reliable energy, and new consumer goods. The growth in trade which will meet those needs will also depend on more packaging, more journeys by air, land, and sea, more logistics hubs, and more work by designers, marketeers, and yes, regulators. The pressures placed on our global environment by this growth, which I've sketched out briefly, will be formidable. Whether it's greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere contributing to global warming, desertification and soil erosion, reducing the space for cultivation, deforestation leading to the disappearance of valuable carbon sinks and precious habitats, air pollution from traditional industry and intensive agriculture, adding to health costs, waste poisoning our oceans, or iconic landscapes under threat from the need for further development. Without action, we face the progressive loss of the natural capital on which all growth, natural, human, and economic, ultimately depends. So the imperative to husband, indeed wherever possible, enhance our natural capital, safeguarding our oceans, cleaning our rivers, keeping our soils fertile and protecting biodiversity, has to be at the heart of any plan for our country and our world. Because we cannot expect to live prosperous and civilized lives in the future unless we recognize that we have to care for that which gives us all life, our planet. And that knowledge is itself already a catalyst for further change. The need to protect our planet better is already accelerating innovation, with entrepreneurs exploring how to develop autonomous electric vehicles, how to change the energy mix that we all rely on, how to reduce our reliance on plastics, how to derive more protein from plants rather than animals, how to grow produce, whether hydroponically or by other means, which leaves a lighter imprint on the earth, and how to use distributed ledger technology to protect habitats, and so much more. So the reality of our times is not just change as the only constant, but accelerating change as the new normal, which is why the title of this conference, Embracing Change, is so appropriate. Because the changes which are shaping all our futures are so historically significant, technologically revolutionary, and economically transformative that we've got no choice but to embrace them and to try to shape them in a progressive and judicious way. Now, I know there is, of course, a natural human desire to stick with what we know, to trust to experience, and to hope that things can go on much as they have before, to prefer the tried to the untried. You hear that when some in industry, and indeed some in the farming industry, say that what we need most at the moment is certainty. I understand that sentiment all too well, as I think does almost everyone in politics. But the truth is that if we try to avoid change, hold the future at bay, and throw up barriers to progress, then we don't stop change coming. We simply leave ourselves less equipped to deal with change as it arrives. The history of nationalised industries, state subsidies for particular sectors, guilds to restrict access to trades, high tariff walls, and all the other tools of so-called economic protection is a melancholy one. The road's paved with good intentions, preserving strategic assets, insulating communities from change, protecting our home market, guaranteeing a supply of essentials. But the path inevitably involves higher costs for consumers, lower productivity from producers, less pressure to husband scarce resources, less concern about sustainability, more rent-seeking and capital accumulation, and less investment in innovation, less dynamism, and ultimately, less security as others forge ahead, economically, scientifically, and socially. So if we want to preserve the things we cherish, a thriving agricultural sector, a healthy rural economy, beautiful landscapes, rich habitats for wildlife, a just society and a fair economy, then we need to be able to shape change rather than seeking to resist it. And the best way to deal with change is to develop adaptability. As we know from the natural world, the best way to thrive in a new environment is to evolve. What we should therefore be looking for in agriculture policy, indeed in all economic policy, is not an illusory fixity or a false sense of certainty, which by definition future events we cannot foresee will always upend. What we should instead be seeking to cultivate are the resources, policies and people that will allow us to adapt, evolve and embrace change as an ally. Which takes me to Brexit. Now, of course, Brexit will mean change. But critically, what it means most of all is that we can once more decide how we shape change and how we meet the challenges ahead. It means we don't need any longer to follow the path dictated by the Common Agricultural Policy. We can have our own national food policy, our own agriculture policy, our own environment policies, our own economic policies, shaped by our own collective interests. The Common Agricultural Policy was designed, like so many aspects of the EU, for another world. The post-war period, when memories of food shortages were hauntingly powerful, and the desire to support a particular model of land use was wrapped up with ideas of a stable countryside that seemed reassuringly attractive after the trauma of industrial-scale conflict. And of course, the CAP has evolved and indeed improved over time, but it's still a fundamentally flawed design. Paying landowners for the amount of agricultural land they have is unjust, inefficient, and it drives perverse outcomes. It gives the most from the public purse to those who have the most private wealth. It bids up the price of land, distorting the market, creating a barrier to entry for innovative new farmers, and entrenching lower productivity. Indeed, perversely, it rewards farmers for sticking to methods of production that are resource inefficient, and it also incentivizes an approach to environmental stewardship, which is all about mathematically precise field margins and not truly ecologically healthy landscapes. As recent scholarship has shown, even the so-called greening payments in Pillar 1 have scarcely brought any environmental benefits at all. We can and must do better. And by we, I mean Defra most of all. Now, I don't want anyone to get hold of the wrong end of the stick. I'm very lucky. The department that I'm privileged to lead has some of the finest public servants in the country working for it. Whether it's the policy professionals, economic analysts, vets, IT engineers, botanists, horticulturalists, hydrologists or geologists, it's a pleasure to work with such dedicated, idealistic and passionate people in Defra. But while the people are brilliant, some of the processes are not. The ways in which we provide financial support to farmers have been far too bureaucratic in the past, not helped by the ludicrous rules and red tape of the CAP that Defra must try to enforce. The Rural Payments Agency has historically taken far too long to get money from government to farmers, and the countryside stewardship schemes that we've run have been dizzyingly complex to apply for. And I've made my views on this clear. All of this when it's our stated aim to actually allocate more funding for agri-environment schemes. Well, we have taken action in the last few months to drive change in these areas, and we will seize opportunities to develop a different regulatory culture once we've left the European Union. I'm encouraged so far that the RPA paid over 91% of farmers their basic payment for this year by the end of December. I'm encouraged, but not satisfied, which is why I'm looking for a new chair of the RPA to work with the Chief Executive and his team to drive further improvement. On countryside stewardship, I want schemes simplified to the extent that any farmer, can complete an application in a working day. Starting at the computer after breakfast, the whole process has to be able to be finished by 6 o'clock, when it will definitely be time for a well-deserved pint. And I'm pleased that Andrew Sells and his team have responded to the challenge with a set of simplified offers, which have already received a warm response. But again, Andrew and I know that we need to go further to develop an even more responsive and efficient model. And that's not all we need to change. Related to the whole question of how we allocate support, we also in Defra need to change our whole approach to inspection. We inspect too often, too ineffectively, and in far too many cases for the wrong things. At any moment, a farmer could be visited by the RPA, Natural England, the Animal Plant and Health Agency, the Environment Agency, or the local authority. Each body may ask for slightly different information, or even the same information, in a slightly different way. Each visit adds to the burden on farmers, yet there is so much overlap without proper coordination. The CAPs and flexibilities, including the ever-present fear of disallowance, mean that we inspect rigidly for those precise field margin dimensions and the exact location of trees in a near pointless exercise in bureaucratic box ticking, while at the same time we expect haphazardly and inefficiently for genuine lapses, such as poor slurry management or inadequate animal welfare. That's why I hope to look at how we can reduce the number of inspections overall, make them more genuinely risk-based, and have them focus on those limited areas where standards are not where they should be. And there's much more we need to change across the board to make the department more effective. There are processes far beyond support payments and inspections which are ripe for modernisation. Take our guidance on the provision of export health certificates, for example. It still requires of Defra the use of carbon paper. While our IT systems in other areas have been improved, we're still some way away from exploiting all the advances in data analytics which we can use to shape and to refine policy and delivery. And even at the most basic level, we're still not the champion that we need to be for British food and farming. Despite hugely energetic efforts by my predecessors, we can still do far more to improve the procurement of British food across our own public sector. I'm determined to drive that change, energetically and across government. As well as making Defra a more efficient, focused and above all innovative department, I also want to drive change in 4 specific areas. First, I want to ensure that we develop a coherent policy on food, integrating the needs of agriculture businesses, other enterprises, consumers, public health and the environment. Second, I want to give farmers and land managers time and the tools to adapt to the future, so we avoid a precipitate cliff edge, but also prepare properly for the changes which are coming. Third, I want to develop a new method of financial support for farmers, which moves away from subsidies for inefficiency to public money for public goods. And finally, I want to ensure that we build natural capital thinking into our approach towards all land use and management, so we develop a truly sustainable future for the countryside. On food, first of all, I want to underline that I recognise the heart of almost all farming businesses is food production. And a core element of Defra's mission is supporting farmers in the provision of competitively priced, healthy, sustainable and nutritious food and pursuing greater market access. But I believe it's critical as we think of food production and the role of farming in the future that we develop policy which looks at the food chain as a whole, from farm to fork, and we also recognise the economic, health and environmental forces shaping the future of food. That's why I'm glad that my colleague Greg Clark, the Business Secretary, announced the creation of a Food and Drink Sector Council in his recent Industrial Strategy White Paper, whose first task will be to develop the emerging proposals for a food and drink manufacturing sector deal. The White Paper also committed to a new challenge fund to transform food production. This will help support farmers and food manufacturers to improve the sustainability and the nutritional benefit of their food. Food and drink is the UK's biggest manufacturing sector and one of its fastest growing, with an increase of 8% in exports to the EU and 10% in exports outside the EU in the first 3 quarters of last year alone. That success has been built on our reputation for quality and provenance, on the knowledge that we have among the highest environmental and animal welfare standards of any nation on earth. So people know when they're buying British, they're buying food which is guaranteed to be high quality and more sustainable. That's why it would be foolish for us to lower animal welfare or environmental standards in trade deals, and in so doing undercut our own reputation for quality. We'll succeed in the global marketplace because we're competing at the top of the value chain, not trying to win a race to the bottom. And government can help in that process by underwriting that reputation for quality, which is why I want us, outside the EU, to develop new approaches to food labelling. Not just badging food properly as British, but also creating a new gold standard metric for food and farming quality. There are already a number of ways in which farmers can secure recognition for high animal welfare or environmental standards, from the Red Tractor scheme to the leaf mark. But while they're all impressive and outstanding indeed, there is still no single scaled measure of how a farmer or food producer performs against a sensible basket of indicators, taking into account such things as soil health, control of pollution, contribution to water quality, and animal welfare. We've been in discussion with a number of farmers and food producers about how we might advance such a scheme, and I think that outside the EU, we could establish a measure of farm and food quality which would be world-leading. Because while price will always be a factor in the choices that consumers make, they're also increasingly making choices based on other factors too. If we look at some of the fastest growing food brands, providing the most value added for both consumers and producers, then it's being able to provide certainty over origins, traceability of ingredients, integrity in production, and a distinctiveness in taste, which matter more and more. Whether it's Beaver soft drinks or Botanista gin, organic milk or West Country farmhouse cheddar, grass-fed beef from Devon or Welsh lamb, Cumberland sausages or Melton Mowbray pork pies, Tyrrell's crisps or Foreman's London cured smoked salmon, the future profits in food production lie in distinctive quality produce. And government can help by acting as a champion for British produce in foreign markets, operating itself, as I've mentioned, a better procurement policy at home, keeping existing market access open, and securing new free trade deals for producers. Now, I understand that people in this room and beyond particularly want to know what will happen to access to our biggest export market, to the EU 27. By definition, we cannot yet know the final outcome of a trade negotiation which is about to get underway, and Defra is preparing for every eventuality. But we're confident of building a new economic partnership with the EU that guarantees tariff-free access for agri-food goods across each other's borders. We know that we've got a deficit in agricultural and horticultural produce with the EU 27. Irish beef farmers, French butter and cheese producers, Dutch market gardeners, and Spanish salad growers all have an interest, just as, if not more acute, than Welsh sheep farmers or Ulster dairy farmers in securing continued tariff-free access between the UK and the EU. But we should be, and we are, more ambitious than that. Securing greater access to and penetration of other markets will be important to British agriculture's further success. Increasing exports to, for example, China is not just a good in itself in trade terms, it also helps the business model of many farmers to work even better. There are, as we all know, parts of the pig, for example, which don't find favour with the British consumer, but which are delicacies in China. Satisfying that demand means that other parts of the carcass can be used to meet demand at home, or indeed elsewhere in Europe, which is currently met by Dutch and by Danish farmers. Pursuing new trade opportunities outside Europe can thus make us more competitive with Europe, which is why it's so encouraging that my colleague Liam Fox has made boosting our trade in food and drink a central priority for 2018. Government can also intervene closer to home where there is market failure. When, for example, some powerful players in the food chain use the scale of their market presence to demand low prices from primary producers, who are much smaller and are disaggregated. And that is why my colleague George Eustace is looking now at overall fairness in the supply chain. We can also ensure that our interventions as government are designed to generate growth are applied more fairly. So, for example, we can look at how the apprenticeship levy works to see how money identified for improving skills training can be spent more effectively across supply chains, helping smaller businesses as well as larger concerns. We can and should invest in both technology and infrastructure. We can direct money to the public goods of scientific innovation, technology transfer, and crucially, decent, universal, superfast broadband. And we must, of course, think about how to make sure that the labour market works effectively as well, so businesses can continue to secure a proper return on their investment. That means not just a flexible migration policy overall, but as we leave the EU, ensuring access to seasonal agricultural labour. But while government has a clear role to play in all of these areas in supporting food production, it's also important that we all appreciate that ultimately food quality is generated not by government, but by innovative and entrepreneurial producers responding to consumer preferences and market signals. And the best way to ensure that consumers have the full choice of quality food that they want is not to try to satisfy every need with home produce, but to pursue comparative advantage. So government must recognise that its interventions need to be targeted, proportionate and limited. Subsidies linked to the size of land holding or headage payments reward incumbents, restrict new thinking and ultimately hold back innovation and efficiency. Industries which come to rely on importing cheap labour run the risk of failing to invest in the innovation required to become genuinely more productive. Labour-intensive production inevitably lags behind capital-intensive production. And having a subsidy system which incentivises farmers to place every acre they can into food production means that public money isn't always being spent on renewing natural capital assets like forestry and wetlands. And as well as thinking about how our interventions to support food production currently affect the environment, we also have to consider the impact of our interventions on the nation's health. Ours is the first generation where more people succumb to non-communicable conditions than to infectious diseases. The risk to public health from contagious conditions is diminishing, and rising dangers are obesity, diabetes, coronary failure, cancer, and a deteriorating mental health. And diet, poor diet, plays a part in all of these conditions. Helping people to make better choices in what they eat is, of course, fraught territory politically. And looking at my own waistline, I should bear in mind that it's incumbent on he who talks about dietary sins to lose the first stone. But government does have a public health role. As Education Secretary, I introduced a school food plan, not just to ensure that school meals were healthier, but also to educate children about where food came from and how to make healthy choices about buying, preparing and enjoying food. And in this role now, I have a responsibility to ask if public money supporting food production is also contributing to improved public health. Indeed, I also have a responsibility to ask if all of the incentives and government interventions everywhere in the food chain work towards economic justice and social inclusion. So that does mean, on the one hand, asking how we can support those farmers, for example, upland sheep farmers, whose profit margins are more likely to be small, but whose contribution to rural life and the maintenance of iconic landscapes is immense. And on the other hand, it also involves taking action to end the currently indefensible situation we have, where food producers are incentivized to send perfectly edible and nutritious surplus stock that they have not sold by a particular date to waste plants, rather than to charities who can distribute it to individuals in need. It's only, I believe, by taking all of these issues together, by looking at food policy in the round, developing an understanding of the economic, social, environmental, health, and other issues at every stage in the food chain, that we will develop the right, coherent strategy for the future. And there are huge opportunities for those in agriculture to play the leading role in shaping this strategy. Rather than devoting intellectual energy and political capital to campaigning for policy interventions designed to insulate farming from change, agriculture's leaders can respond to growing public interest in debates about food, animal welfare, the environment, health, and economic justice by demonstrating, as so many in this room are doing, how their innovative and dynamic approaches are enhancing the environment, safeguarding animal welfare, producing food of the highest quality, improving public health, and contributing to a fairer society. Now, given the scale and nature of the change which is coming, I also recognise that farmers need to be given the time and the tools to become more adaptable. We'll be saying more about our plans in a command paper to be published later this spring. And of course, the proposals that we outline will have to be subject to consultation, co-designed. But I want to say a little about the direction of travel that I think we should take. I believe that we should help landowners and managers to make the transition from our current system of subsidy to a new approach of public money for public goods over time. We'll formally leave the EU in March of 2019, but the government anticipates that we will agree an implementation or transition period for the whole country with the EU lasting for around another 2 years. We've guaranteed that the amount that we allocate to farming support in cash terms will be protected throughout and beyond this period, right up until the end of this Parliament in 2022. And we will continue to support countryside stewardship agreements entered into before we leave the EU, and we will ensure that no one in an existing scheme is unfairly disadvantaged when we transition to new arrangements. We propose to pay the 2019 BPS scheme on the same basis as we do now, and I then envisage guaranteeing that BPS payments continue for a transition period in England, which should last a number of years beyond the implementation period, depending on consultation. During these years, we propose to first reduce the largest BPS payments in England. We could do this through a straight cap at a maximum level or through a sliding scale of reductions to the largest payments first. After the implementation period, this transitional payment could be paid to the recipient without the need to comply with all of the onerous existing cross-compliance rules and procedures. Inspections would, of course, continue, but in the streamlined and risk-based fashion that I described earlier. Provided our own animal welfare, environmental, and other laws were observed, this payment would be guaranteed. So this should provide every existing farmer who receives a BPS payment with guaranteed income over this extended transition period. That guaranteed income should provide time for farmers to change their business model if necessary, help to make the investment necessary for any adjustments, and to prepare for the future. We'll also look at ways to support farmers who may choose to leave the industry. And after that transition period, we'll replace BPS with a system of public money for public goods. The principal public good that we'll invest in is, of course, environmental enhancement. In thinking about how better to support farmers in the work of environmental protection and enhancement, it's critical, as everyone in this room, but not everyone outside appreciates, to recognise that there is no inherent tension between productive farming and care for the natural world. Quite the opposite. I've seen for myself how many of our best farmers, our most productive and progressive farmers, place thoughtful environmental practice and careful husbanding of resources at the heart of their business. Take the vital question of soil health. Min or no-till approaches, which require less expenditure in inputs, and of course keep more carbon in the soil, are both economically more efficient and environmentally progressive. But under the CAP, farmers have been encouraged to focus on yield overall, rather than productivity specifically. This has led to decades of damage in the form of significant and destructive soil erosion, estimated in one study by Cranfield University to have cost the economy around £1.2 billion every year. We now have an opportunity to reverse this unhappy trend. Sustainably managed land is far more productive than land that is stressed and stripped of its nutrients. But moving to more sustainable and ultimately productive farming methods can involve transitional costs and pressures. So we plan to provide new support for those who choose to farm now in the most sustainable fashion. And as well as supporting progressive and productive farming methods, we also want to support what economists call the provision of ecosystem services. Building on previous countryside stewardship and agri-environment schemes, we'll design a scheme accessible to almost any landowner or manager who wishes to enhance the natural environment by planting woodland, providing new habitats for wildlife, increasing biodiversity, contributing to improved water quality, and returning cultivated land to wildflower meadows or other more natural states. And we will also make additional money available for those who wish to collaborate to secure environmental improvements collectively at landscape scale. Enhancing our natural environment is a vital mission for this government. We're committed to ensuring that we leave the environment in a better condition than we found it. And leaving the European Union allows us to deliver the policies required to achieve that, to deliver a green Brexit. But vital as investment in our environment is, it's not the only public good that I think we should invest in. I believe that we should also invest in technology and skills, alongside infrastructure, public access, and rural resilience. There's a tremendous opportunity for productivity improvement in our farms now. We already have some of the best productive, most impressively performing farms in the world, and there's no reason why our farmers cannot lead the way globally in achieving better levels of productivity through adoption of best practice and new technologies. On technology, we should build on the innovation pioneered by our superb higher education institutions, like Harper Adams University, by investing more in automation and machine learning, moving from the hands-free hectare to the hands-free farm, with drilling, harvesting, picking and packaging, all automated, precision mapping of every inch under cultivation, with targeted laser treatment of pests and weeds, and highly focused application of any other treatment required. We should invest more in the sensor technology that can tell where, when, and how livestock should be fed, housed, and bred to maximise both yield and individual animal health and welfare. And we should ensure that the next generation of farmers are equipped to make the most of these technological breakthroughs by better integrating the research work being undertaken by the most innovative institutions with the ongoing training those working on the land should receive. And I hope to say more about how we can reform land-based education again later in the spring. Critical to making this new investment in tech and skills work is, of course, proper infrastructure, superfast broadband and reliable 5G coverage. If I can get reliable and unbroken mobile phone and internet coverage in a tunnel under the Atlantic as I travel between one Faroe Island and the next, I should be able to get it in Oxfordshire. So I'm delighted that my colleague Matt Hancock has made it a priority to ensure that rural areas get the digital infrastructure they need, and I will do whatever I can to help. Public access, I know, can be contentious, and I won't get into the weeds of the debate on rights of way now, but the more the public, and especially school children, get to visit, understand, and appreciate our countryside, the more I believe they will appreciate, support, and champion our farmers. Open Farm Sunday and other great initiatives like it help reconnect urban dwellers with the earth. And they also help secure consent for investment in the countryside, as well as support for British produce. So public access is a public good. And then there is rural resilience. There are any number of smaller farm and rural businesses which help keep communities coherent and ensure that the culture in agriculture is kept healthy. Whether it's upland farmers in Wales or Cumbria, crofters in Scotland, or small livestock farmers in Northern Ireland, we need to ensure support is there for those who keep rural life vital. The work of the Prince's Countryside Fund has been invaluable here, and the kind of enterprises that it supports are, I believe, worthy of public support. Now, I recognise the list of public goods that I've identified is not exhaustive, but then our budget is not unlimited. And I look forward to consulting on these priorities. But we must start from the presumption that we should only support clear public goods that the market will not, left to itself, provide. And that takes me to the importance of natural capital. In thinking of our countryside and of rural life overall, its overall worth to all of us goes far beyond its economic value alone. Like everyone here, I'm moved by the beauty of our natural landscapes. I feel a sense of awe and wonder at the richness and abundance of creation. I value wildlife as good in its own right. I admire those who work with nature and on our land. I respect the skill and passion of farmers, growers, shepherds, stockmen, vets and agronomists who provide us with safe, high-quality food and drink. And I want to see them prosper. And I know these feelings are shared across the country, but capturing these values in public policy can sometimes be difficult, which is why the natural capital approach can be so valuable. It allows us to bed into policymaking a direct appreciation of the importance of field and forest, river and wetland, healthy soil, and air free from pollution. It's just one tool among many in the formation of policy, but a very powerful one in ensuring that we think of our responsibility to future generations to hand on a country and a planet in a better state than we found it. And that has to be the aim for all our policies on food, farming, the landscape, and our broader environment. We have to embrace change, which secures a more sustainable future for all those who will inherit what we have built. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I think there's plenty to talk about there. Get your answers, questions rather, in so that you can get even more answers. Next, I'd like to introduce Ted McKinney from the USDA to speak to you. We're going to move straight on because we're running up against time. Thank you.
Good morning. I didn't get a chance to shake your hand earlier. Hi, Anna. How are you? Well, let me just say thank you very, very much for the opportunity to come and join you. I have known about this conference for some time. In my many years in the private sector in the U.S., I've been aware of this conference, and I've had my team members attend, and so it's a pleasure to be here personally. This is my third time to Oxford, the first two in the private sector, and so this is the first time I've had a chance to really see the beauty of the town, and certainly of this very, very historic Oxford University. I also want to thank Caroline and her board of directors. Anna, you as our moderator, Mr. Secretary, you for teeing this thing off, because this is an incredible time, and I just couldn't be more pleased at the theme you've selected, which is embracing change. I think not only is the UK going through a number of changes, Brexit and all that goes with that, but so have we, with a significant change in our election and all that goes with that. More on that in just a moment. I also want to let you know that I have an affinity to all of you. With the last name of McKinney, you can guess there's some Irish in me. My dad's side came from Ireland, mostly came to the U.S. after the potato famine, or during that potato famine. My mom's side are the Kirkpatricks. So any Scots here, for example? Yes. Up in Edinburgh, Dumfries. I have yet to be there, but many of my family has been there. I understand Sir Roger Kirkpatrick, years and years ago, decades ago, may have hung out with Robert the Bruce. So anyway, I'm learning my history here. But I want you to know that there's a strong affinity, because my roots are very much from this part of the world, and that means a great deal to me, particularly as an amateur historian. I appreciate that very, very much. I also want to acknowledge my team members who are here. I have heard from many of you just how strongly you feel about the work of those who are with the Foreign Ag Service and the embassies. So Stan, Steve, and Jennifer, thank you for what you're doing on this wonderful relationship building between the UK and the US. Well, I want to say thank you, and I express regrets that Minister De Castro could not be here. We understand that there is a bereavement in the family, and so for him to take the measures he has with coming online via audio and video is just very, very significant. I also want you to know it's an honor for me to be here representing Secretary Perdue, the President, and the United States. I'm quite the historian, and my area of great emphasis is World War II. And I continue to marvel at the relationship between our two countries for that war and certainly ones before that. And the fact that so many of our country emigrated from Europe, and the UK in particular, is very, very significant in my mind. So I've believed long and hard that there's this strong affinity between our countries, which is doubly pleasurable for me to be here at this Oxford Farming Conference. And I also wanted to acknowledge, I didn't get to say hello to the 18 emerging young farmers here, but this is a program that I have embraced both when I was Director of Agriculture for the state of Indiana, working under then Governor Pence, now Vice President Pence. So I hope there's a chance to say hello to some of you. So many of you do not know me. I come from a farm as well. I relate very much to what you've done. I've worked almost the entire food chain. I grew up on a large farm north of Indianapolis, Indiana. My twin brother manages the farm primarily, which means he works for a living, unlike me. We have seed corn and seed soybeans. Up until just a couple of years ago, we had a large swine operation. Using all the advanced technologies that you can imagine. In fact, we're a dealer for many of those precision planting technologies. So I'm very much an advocate of embracing change and embracing new and different technologies. But I'll also say I have a great deal of respect for those who choose a different way of producing. For example, we have a growing organic business in the U.S., and just as all embrace those who chase and embrace the latest of technologies, so too am I embracing those who may choose a different way of producing their crops. So it's a very, very diverse country we have in the U.S., not unlike what you have in the U.K. And I choose and have, I think, lived in my life the embracing of all of that. Well, I'll say I don't know that I can remember in recent years where there has been so much change in the U.S., in agriculture, and in the UK. And I think in many cases, we're both dealing with some of the same things. Our election brought with it an incredible change. We had farmers, including my own family, who were suffering under the overreach of federal government regulations, and they can now breathe again. President Trump came in and said, we're going to, for every regulation we add, we have to eliminate 2. He's doubled down on that a few months ago to said, if we're going to add 1, we have to eliminate 3. And this has allowed our farmers to breathe again, to do what they do so well, and always abiding by the best of animal welfare standards and certainly environmental standards. So I'm living that change. I'm seeing that change. And I see for you a similar opportunity. The question will be, will you adapt to that change, or will you be allowed to make those changes? And I think the answers are resting with each and every one of you. The UK's decision to leave the European Union was another major event. And we take no position on that. We respect the decisions that were made, and my discussions with many of you yesterday acknowledged that it's time to get on with it, and I recognize that you are, and Mr. Secretary, your comments are evidence that you really are moving forward with that. We believe the UK, and we know that it is a strong trade partner, but to be very clear, we'd like to enhance that. Now, Caroline, you said last night at the reception, and I respect that I talked about trade being about exports. There might have been one time when I talked about exports as trade, but I'll say that most of the time I see, and I say this from my heart and my head, trade is a two-way street. It has to be going both ways. Exports do not equal trade. If you don't win with trade, then what's the purpose of the trade? So I want you to know that the U.S. remains as one of the most open countries in which to do trade. Certainly there are high standards and there's equivalencies that need to be reached. And I think in the case of many of you, we're working on that. But no is not the normal answer from the U.S. If those high bars for animal welfare and the environment and other food safety orientations are met, welcome. We're hoping for the same from you. Trade is a two-way street. Another value that we share is that desire to improve farm and rural prosperity. In our own case, rural America continues to slip in its numbers. I don't know how that would rest in the UK, but we're doing everything we can to lift up rural America. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to have a wonderful tour of the Drax energy plant, where a number of wood pellets from the U.S. are coming to supply that, and single-handedly almost turning around and meeting some of the goals of the UK in terms of climate change. We love that. These are not wood pellets from fine woods that might go to furniture or lumber and home building and those kinds of things. This is waste that might normally be used in other ways, landfill even perhaps. And we now have an opportunity to provide you with a product that is just simply outstanding in helping you meet climate change goals and reviving some of our industry. It's an example of the partnership that we would like to continue to expand upon. Well, in the U.S., we're at an interesting time. We're entering the year where the Farm Bill needs to be redone. I'm optimistic that we'll get a decent Farm Bill. The number one issue that farmers have expressed is this opportunity that they wish to contribute of their own money for crop insurance and thus have a safety net to address those very difficult times when floods, rains, or catastrophic events might come. Mr. Secretary, I admire you for some of the changes you're proposing in those and similar areas. Secretary Perdue is leading a task force to improve the quality of life for people living in rural areas, develop a reliable workforce, and roll back regulations to allow communities to grow and thrive. Again, I'll tell you, of the 30, 40, 50 groups that have been through my office, they have talked about how some of this rollback of onerous regulations has given them predictability so that they can plan their farms, plan their food businesses, and move forward. And I would challenge you to say that maybe you all can do the same. You and I both know that we're somewhere on this journey between 7 and 9. 7 billion people about 3 years ago, maybe 4, I remember an article in the Wall Street Journal. It was a photo of a Filipino baby where they described that that was the 7 billionth person on the planet. How in the world they figured out that was the 7 billionth person, I don't know, but it was the Wall Street Journal. I accept it. We're going to 9 by 2050, plus or minus. We've got the world that's increasing in their demand for protein. We have greater opportunity where greater incomes are affording the chance to get more education for young children, girls and boys. And so I think we have an untold opportunity as a world to get this right with trade. But we have headwinds. We in the U.S. have continued to see sanitary, phytosanitary barriers erect. We remain fairly open. I'll accept that there might be critics of the U.S., but as a country, relative to most others, we're fairly open. And yet, sanitary, phytosanitary trade barriers continue to erect. So we're watching this wonderful movement that you have going on with Brexit to see, will the UK be that trading partner that we'd seek, or will there be roadblocks? I'll conclude by just saying that this is a great opportunity for me to be here. I continue to remain that the opportunities between our countries is untold. I don't know that the UK will ever have an opportunity again, at least not in the near future, probably not in a generation like you have now, to get right, whatever right means to you, the ideas of regulations, environmental care, animal welfare, productivity, opportunities to export. We will not interfere in that process. If asked, we're happy to share with all of you how we do things, but only if asked. We're not going to impose our will in any way, shape, or form except to say we'd love to do more trade. And I'll remind you, trade is a two-way street. So thank you for having me here. I've enjoyed the one-on-one conversations. Mr. Secretary, it's been a pleasure to be with you, and I'll look forward to entertaining your questions. Thank you.
I'm not going to stand up now to introduce our next speaker because we're going to play you a video of his speech. And this is Paolo de Castro, who is Vice Chair of the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee at the European Parliament. And he's going to deliver his speech by video, I hope. I'm peering over to the side here to make sure it works.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to take part of this conference today. And first of all, I would like to apologize to not be in Oxford with you at the Oxford Farming Conference, but yesterday, Cosimo da Cirignola, the General Secretary of CIHAM, the High Center of International Study of Mediterranean Countries, is passing away, and Cosimo was more than one brother for me. But going in my speech, I want to address the issue of the consequence of the departure of the UK from the European Union in three main aspects: the impact of the European Union budget, the impact of the common agricultural policy, and the future trade relationship between the UK and the European Union. I consider the latter the most challenging part of the negotiation ongoing, because the change in the level of the integration in trade will affect farm and business, and this is not able to be avoided. As I met, I have to take into account this impact, because the European Parliament will have the final say on the outcome of negotiation, both of the departure deal and the future trade agreement. So, few words before starting. In the past months, I noticed that the Brexit dominates the British news. Maybe this is normal, but let me tell you something that could help you to put this in this perspective. In my country, in Italy, in other European Union countries, Brexit is not a front-page news. Some days, it's not news at all. There are much more other news pressing the issue for Italy and other countries. So, let's go to the European budget, and I would like you to pay attention to the slide that is proposed to all of you. The UK, as you see, is a net contributor to the European Union budget, and the departure could create a gap of about 10.2 billion euro per year. Due to the rebate, the Brexit will lead to a growth in the size of the European Union budget in relative terms, as a share of the European Union gross national income. In order to fill the 10 billion gap, the European Union is working on three main ideas: increasing the contribution of the remaining 27 member states, decreasing the expenditure and the expanding of the European Union own financial resources. The most likely solution will be a combination of the three options. But anyway, if the reduction of the expenditure is a part of the solution, the common agricultural policy will be likely under pressure. The CAP could face larger or smaller decrease in available resources, also depending on what happens in other chapters of the budget. About the future of the CAP. The share of the CAP in the European Union budget has decreased after time, but is still more than 35% of the total expenditure. Direct payment alone account for more than a quarter of the European Union budget. The UK departure could open a gap of about 3 billion euro per year in the CAP budget, which is nearly 40%, as I said, billion in total. In order to minimize the possible cuts, some propose the national co-financing of the direct payment envelope, but this idea has not found supporter so far. So, in the future, the CAP could have a lower budget, and this is an element of uncertainty, but the European Union seems to have a clear idea of the future CAP as a policy. We have achieved, most of you knows, we have achieved some result of the simplification of the policy thanks to the so-called omnibus regulation, which I was the negotiator for the European Parliament. In the same regulation, we have made the risk management tools more accessible on set measures to improve farmers' bargaining power in the supply chain. So in the omnibus regulation, we did a good job to make some simplification, to make some step ahead on what will be the next reform. In fact, in the communication, The Future of Food and Farming, that the European Commission has announced further steps exactly in the same direction of omnibus regulation. The proposal of new implementation plans aims to cut the red tape further. As a consequence, the greening will be replaced by a simple and more sensible solution for farmers and member states. The rural development policy will focus on innovation and digitalization of agriculture. Many of these proposals of the CAP post-2020 recall the ones that the European Parliament tabled before the actual reform, before the 2030 reform. And many of you will remember the resolution of the former Scottish MEP, George Lyon. To sum it, the CAP will remain a common European policy while providing more flexibility to farmers and member states. Market and trade orientation of the CAP is another important element. The agreement with Japan, for example, has been a major achievement for the European Union farming and the food sector. So what about the future relationship between European Union and UK? In comparison to European Union 27, the UK is a relatively small market, but the UK is currently the second largest European economy. It is highly integrated with the other European Union member states in terms of trade and value chains in the agricultural and food single market is the most integrated one in the European Union. Thus changing the terms of the current partnership will inevitably affect business in the UK and the European Union. According to the European Parliament studies, the magnitude of the impact of Brexit and the European Union farmers and food producers is linked to the economy proximity to the UK. So in the next decades, the impact will depend of the bilateral trade agreement between European Union and United Kingdom. A trade deal could be agreed within so-called transition period. It will have to be ratified by the European Parliament and by the more than 35 national and regional parliaments. Trade negotiations usually are very long, and frankly speaking, I'm not sure that 2 years will be enough. According to the negotiation position of the European Union, likely to be officially endorsed in January, the transition period should be even shorter, ending on the 31st December 2020. This position is a matter of logic, because this is the natural terms of the European Union budget period. So it's the ending of the budget period. Of course, it should be in some way, at the same time, we should start we should conclude the transition period. In the transition period of the European Union negotiation, common agricultural policy, including would remain in place for the UK. This is important to underline. Because since the beginning in Brussels, the transition period has been intended as a means for stability. Thus, it should be based on the continuity of the rules. The budget will continue, the rules should be followed. In the same period, the UK should continue to comply with European Union trade policy. Concerning the future bilateral agreement, the UK and the European Union are not starting from scratch, but if agreements such as the ones with Canada, the CETA, or South Korea are assumed as a starting point, the level of integration would likely to be much lower than today. So put in this way, it's very hard to see the Brexit as a step forward both for the UK and European Union. A lower level of integration means higher costs for businesses in terms of bureaucracy, tariff, and non-tariff measures. I'm very concerned about the non-tariff measure especially. In the role of the rapporteur for the European Parliament Committee on Agriculture and Rural Development, I followed the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership negotiation and the debate in the civil society very close. And I learned that the sanitary and phytosanitary rules might become a particularly sensitive issue for the consumers and the public opinions. And regarding the producer, sanitary and phytosanitary rules are not technical barriers per se. They can be as such because of the lack of alignment of the regulations. With the end of common rules, the sanitary and phytosanitary rules and other technical measures, and any single new rule adopted without a coordination between UK and European Union has a strongly potential to affect trade negatively. In 2018, the most difficult and delicate part of the negotiation between European Union and the UK is going to start. In most of the negotiation I have done in my life, reaching an agreement seems impossible at the beginning. But let me say, at the end, a compromise was always found. So at least what we can ask to our negotiator is that they bear in mind very clear the role of the agri-food sector, which has an important part of the economy and an important part of our society. So thank you very much and apologize again to not be there. Thanks.
Now we hope Paolo de Castro has joined us live. Hello, good morning to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Good morning everybody, and thank you, Secretary, thank you, that meeting, to have been nice to see you both.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your speech. Well, let's start our debate now. Mr. Gove, first of all, could you just confirm, I'm sure a lot of people have been reading the papers this morning, you didn't actually mention that year date 2024 specifically in your speech. If you could confirm that for us. We also have a question from someone on the app, which says, how will you ensure that by extending farm support until 2024, UK farmers don't lose out to their EU counterparts who will see significant reforms in 2020?
Well, the first thing to say is that the use of words like transition and implementation can be sometimes misheard by certain audiences. Let me try to clarify. Firstly, exactly as Paolo mentioned, we want to have a 2-year transition period from the point at which, or more or less 2-year transition period, from the point at which we formally leave the European Union in March 2019. Michel Barnier has suggested, and Paolo confirmed, that there's a certain logic from the point of view of the EU in saying that that should be 21 months long rather than 24 months. So that the UK is in that transition period right up until the 31st of December 2020. And in that transition period, we abide by and respect the rules of the European Union. There may be 1 or 2 areas where there are wrinkles and where there's not perfect alignment, but broadly, we respect the rules even though we don't have representation as we prepare to depart. Now, the second thing is the commitment that we've made overall on cash for the level of support that UK farmers will enjoy. And we've said that irrespective of when that transition period in itself ends, we will continue to provide the same amount that is currently provided under the Common Agricultural Policy in cash terms for UK farmers right up until 2022. And what I propose, and what our command paper will say more about, is that we will also continue to provide people with BPS payments for a further UK-specific, agriculture-specific transition period beyond 2022. And I envisage that should be around 5 years from the end of the existing BPS in 2019. So that's 5 years when we have broadly the same amount with a cap. And how that cap will operate, whether it will be a hard cap or whether we progressively reduce higher amounts, again, is a matter for consultation. The reason why I mentioned 5 years is that it seems to me to be a good starting point for a debate about how we can balance the need to give people the flexibility they need in order to make that transition, while at the same time not perpetuating a state of affairs whereby people rely on an existing form of subsidy and think that the new world will never dawn. Final thing that I would say, just following on from the question there, is, of course, when you talk about being disadvantaged relative to EU colleagues, disadvantage is in the eye of the beholder. Now, again, as Paolo has pointed out, it will be the case that the Common Agricultural Policy will be reformed and certain reform propositions have been put forward. But it's already the case that across the EU27 we see different views about how the CAP might develop. One of the things that I expect is that there will still be some form of area-based payment existing within the EU after it's been phased out in the UK. Now, some people might say that's an advantage for the EU. I would argue, as I argued in my remarks earlier today, that's actually an advantage for the UK in allowing us to use our agricultural support funding in a way which incentivises greater productivity and provides a greater level of environmental enhancement. But I recognise, of course, that good people can disagree about whether or not that is an advantage or a disadvantage to UK farmers. I think it's a significant advantage and look forward to hearing from people about how we can make it work even better.
We have a question from the floor here now, if we could get a microphone to Jim Pace, I believe. No. Stephen Fell. Sorry, I can't see. The lights are bright in my eyes. I'm so sorry. Same hairdo. Yeah.
Stephen Fell, Yorkshire farmer and Leaf. Secretary of State, you expect me to applaud you for what you said about combining productive and innovative agriculture with environmental enhancements, with the right stimuluses, and we look forward to hearing about those. But however, as I believe exports will become a vital part of developing sustainable British agriculture in a global marketplace, how are you going to coordinate other government departments, BEIS and DIT, to ensure that we're not sidelined in any export strategy? And how can you assist aspiring agricultural export businesses, bearing in mind that the highest standards such as leaf mark, which you mentioned, will be an essential to market entry?
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Stephen. There are a number of things there. It's not just other government departments that can help. The Oxford Farming Conference has helped by making sure that Ted and I can have conversations about the vital importance of respecting the interests of both our agri-food sectors in any future trade deal and any future relationship. But more broadly, thinking about government, one of the things that I tried to do in the speech was to stress that agriculture shouldn't be seen in isolation in policy terms. We should put agriculture at the heart of our broader approach towards food and drink manufacturing and export. And that's why in the Industrial Strategy White Paper, we talked about the creation of a Food and Drink Sector Council and the development of a food and drink sector deal. And the reason for that is precisely because I want to get all of government working together in order to ensure that our most successful manufacturing sector and our fastest growing becomes even more successful. I want to make sure that everyone feels that they have skin in the game. And that's also why in the area of my speech about food, I talked about the commitment that Liam Fox has made to make British food and drink his top priority when it comes to trade conversations and negotiations during the course of this year, and also why I mentioned the role that the Department for Health can play as well, because I want to have the maximum buy-in across government for an approach towards making the most of British food. And I think that there's no tension between saying that our food is produced to the very highest standards, as the Leaf Mark reinforces, and being economically successful, because I think for Britain, other countries may make a different decision. For Britain, we want to compete at the top of the value chain, and therefore building a reputation for the healthiest, most nutritious, highest quality food with the highest standards of animal welfare helps badge us as the best of the best.
Let's take a question over here, please.
Hello, Andrew McShane from Hutchinson's Agronomy Business. A question for Secretary of State. I was very pleased to hear the support for the no-till agriculture approach, and also very interested to hear Mr. McKinney's comments on false erection of phytosanitary barriers to trade. Now, bearing in mind the importance of glyphosate in terms of no-till agriculture, and bearing in mind the shambles we've seen on the recent 5-year extension of glyphosate approval, will the Secretary of State be looking forward to taking the opportunity of Brexit to introduce a science-based regulatory regime for crop protection products and other inputs into UK agriculture?
Very briefly. Yeah.
Yes, is the short answer. More broadly, I think that Ted and I were talking about glyphosate last night, and one of the things that we recognise that it's an invaluable tool in making sure that actually you can have more environmentally sustainable methods of cultivation, which help to protect and enhance soil quality. Now, in the future, it may be that there are technical breakthroughs that allow us to apply interventions like glyphosate with an even lighter touch, and that will be a good thing. But ultimately, we need to take a science and risk-based approach to making sure that farmers have the tools that they need in order to farm productively, and glyphosate is part of that, and it needs to remain part of it. And of course, there were discussions at an EU level about reauthorising them. One thing I want to say is that even though we're leaving the EU, I'm full of admiration for Phil Hogan, the current Agriculture Commissioner, for the way in which, after some mid-air turbulence, he managed to land this, this particular policy very well.
Can I bring in Paolo de Castro on that? I mean, it took a long time, didn't it, to get a decision backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards?
Yeah, let me say first of all that I would like to underline again that we are totally agreeing with the Secretary Gove that we want to free tariff access. We don't want to make any difficulty on the trade between UK, between European Union, of course. But the risk on the table is not the negotiation between us, but it could be the negotiation between UK and the rest of the world. Because in your trade agreement, when you will do other agreement with other countries in the world, if you are not totally aligned with the European standards, that would be a problem in the future, and there would be the difficulty how to manage this. And this is, for example, the case of the gentleman asked before about glyphosate. I totally agree that we should be on the scientific basis. This is for sure. But anyway, when you will make such agreement with other countries, if you are not totally aligned with the European standards and European rules, of course there will be problems. And this is one thing that we are worried about the future. So let's go, of course, on the common agricultural policy. And I believe that the direction we have done on the last midterm review, what we call omnibus, is exactly the direction that you mentioned in your speech, Mike. Because what we want to do is not only simplification, which is, of course, we need more simplification, but we need more flexibility to adapt the environmental measure. And this is the idea of what we call the menu. So the country, the member state, can choose the best measure to apply and to have a better result on the environment. Because we agree with you that the greenings didn't work well. This is what the Court of Auditors already said. And we want to modify in the future to be flexibility, to give more environment, but at the same time, let me say to UK farmers, we don't want to transform common agricultural policy in common environmental policy. We should maintain the farmers in the center of our policy. We should maintain the competitiveness of farmers. We need to produce more because the people need more food. We need to have such more productive farmers in our countries. So the balance between environmental and economic should be very focused. Otherwise, the risk is to destroy what we achieve in 40 and 50 years of this policy, and we don't get much result of the environment.
Mr. Castro, thank you very much indeed. Do we have a question for Ted McKinney specifically from anyone?
Yes.
Yeah, as well. I was very interested also in your two-way street trade, and I think, that links in as well. Very briefly.
Let me address the gentleman's questions. Yeah. Glyphosate is one of the safest products ever invented in the crop protection chemical area, and it is a darn near crime that it's been villainized in the manner that it has. Now, we can point at all kinds of different reasons as to why, but I'd say they're all, or nearly all, unfortunate. And so I think that is perhaps one of the best examples of where Brexit can stand up and say enough with policies that villainize incredibly good and valuable products. And by the way, not just for farmers, but for consumers and homeowners alike. At least that's the experience that I've had. You asked about sanitary, phytosanitary. Well, with the WTO came very strict rules on how trade should be handled around the world. And a good thing, I might add. I think the WTO, with all its frustrations, has been a very, very good thing for the world. But with the advent of the WTO, with very strict rules, there entered into the equation these sanitary, phytosanitary barriers where protectionist tendencies could find their way in under the guise of food safety and environment and so forth. Okay, I respect that. We take great pride in our farming and ag community about food safety and the environment and animal welfare, all of that. Very, very, very important. But we cannot let that become a means for interference with trade. So we'll be watching with great interest how you work on that, Mr. Secretary. Great deal of interest.
Very much.
You won't be alone.
Thank you. I think we'll find a good way forward.
You mentioned, Mr. Gove, that you were hoping that people will be able to fill in a form, say, for countryside stewardship from between 9 and 6. There is a question here. How can farmers sit down to the computer and complete an application for a stewardship scheme in a day when rural broadband is still an issue for many?
Well, a very, very good point. The test is a test for the team at RPA and Natural England, to which they've risen so far very well, which is simplify, simplify, simplify. And so it's I'm talking about laboratory conditions here, where you can have, if you can imagine such a thing, a clear run and an uncluttered 8 hours or so in order to complete everything that's required. That's the test, that's the standard to which I'm holding people in those agencies. But the broader point about broadband is well made. One moment during the last year when I'm afraid I burst out laughing spontaneously and rather perhaps inappropriately when I was listening to the radio was when I heard that the traditional guy in a bonfire in Devon had been replaced by a BT OpenReach van. But My colleague Matt Hancock, as someone who represents a rural constituency that itself has suffered from poor broadband, is really shaking things up in this area. And there is much more that we can do. And I recognise that so much of what I talk about in terms of either simplifying administration or improving access to technology depends upon that infrastructure. It's critical. We have to be held to account over the next year or two about how we improve that.
Thank you very much. We are really short of time. I'm sorry about we started late. We have a question here on the side. There's a microphone coming to you.
Thank you. Sarah Bell, farmer from Oxford Farming Conference, Emerging Leader. Warm words, Mr. Gove, are much appreciated. But I would like to ask you, is it time for a digital strategy for UK agriculture? And how can government start to support that in pulling together what is a fairly disparate system of data movement at the moment?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And one thing that I could have mentioned in the speech is that and I just touched on briefly, is yes, we brought in a team from a data analytics company called ASI to look at how Defra uses data. There were some significant steps forward under Liz Truss, my predecessor, but there's still a lot more that we can do. And I alluded briefly to the fact that when it comes to export health certificates, and this may become an even bigger issue, of course, as we leave the EU, we still have a situation where the advice that we give to people issuing export health certificates requires them to have carbon paper in order to produce copies. It's from another age, literally. The recommendations from ASI they're quite complex and detailed, but they do give us an opportunity for us to use the data that we collect in a much better and more integrated fashion. And I was chatting to Minette Batters last night about precisely this. Minette makes the point that if you look at some other jurisdictions like Australia, they can provide much more information to the consumer and to others about the traceability, the quality, the nature of production, and it also allows decision makers and policy makers, not just in government, to think hard about future investment. We've got to go further in this area, and I hope to say a little bit more about some of the recommendations that ASI have made and some of the changes that we hope to make in order to bring about precisely the sort of changes that you allude to.
Thank you very much. We have a question around the corner here. Sorry, I couldn't see you behind the podium.
Secretary of State, thank you. Edward Morehouse. I'm an MBA student at the Royal Ag University Business School. You mentioned soil management with less inputs quite a few times in your speech, and once productivity actually in the same sentence. And in preserving the former, soil, and boosting the latter, productivity, are you advocating adoption post-19 and CAP of GM seed technology?
No, I'm not. But one of the things that I do believe is that ultimately, as the Cranfield study suggests, the incentives have been poorly aligned in the past. And they have encouraged, not because farmers want to, but because the system has encouraged them to, in some cases, a short-term approach towards soil health. And what I want to do is to make sure that we have a system that rewards people for making sure that they enhance soil quality, and they recognise that that's not just good for productivity overall, but also good in terms of a natural capital approach towards the environment and towards farming in the future. Now, I alluded to the fact that gene editing in the future could provide all sorts of opportunities. The science is still in its infancy, but I do think that it's important that we regard gene editing as a means of science helping us to do faster what farmers have been doing for generations, which is essentially accelerate the process of breeding and evolution. And I think we should have an open mind about that technology and not allow debates from the past to influence how we look at that technology. And we need to look at it in a properly risk-based way, informed by the science, aware of the potential benefits that it can bring, but also challenging those who are its most prominent advocates to satisfy the public about any concerns that they might have as well.
I have to say we have run out of time now, so thank you very much for your questions on the app and here in the conference hall as well. Thank you very much indeed to Ted McKinney, Michael Gove and Paolo de Castro. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. And thank you all. If you could show your appreciation for our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
as you're all leaving now for coffee, I have to remind you to be back very promptly at 10:45. So a very, very quick coffee and then back again. Thank you.